Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Get Carmen in court with George Carman QC, Britain's most feared lawyer, the man behind the advocate. Carmen was, and perhaps still is, Britain's most famous lawyer within living memory. Equally feared and respected, he made his name as an erudite and incisive advocate, largely in the field of libel. He is the subject of a new book by Karen Phillips, a close friend of George Carman. I am delighted to say that Karen joins me live on the line now. Karen, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles.
Thank you so much I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. When this landed on my desk, I literally, a huge grin came across my face, because I was living in London in the early 90s and late 80s and early 90s, and the name Carmen, because I used to hang out with a bunch of QCs in the Cheshire Cheese, and the name Carmen, of course, was both feared and respected, and I actually sort of sat once with the great man at a table and couldn't say a bleeding word to him.
I know the problem.
So for many, he was, Britain's best known lawyer. He was feared and respected, I suppose, in equal respect. But this book goes further than just if you like, his incisive style in the courtroom.
Yes, I wanted to really discuss him as a human being, as well as being the devastating cross-examiner he was known to be. Of course, a lot of people were terrified of him and said that they hated being Carmenized, which was their fear, being cross-examined, because he was a plain speaker and always wanted to get down to the truth.
So, if you can, give me a little bit of a colour, because obviously everybody sort of knew him as this formidable, QC, this formidable silk. But where did Carmen actually, what were his beginnings?
Well, he came from quite a modest background. His mother was in the clothes business. She had a beautiful designer shop in the north of England, where he grew up in Lancashire. His father was a furniture salesman. His mother had great ambition. She was Irish. She was very strong. She believed in always coming first, in a way. And she encouraged George really to progress with his life. And she was the one who had the vision that he should go to Oxford and go on and have a wonderful career in whichever area he decided. She didn't try and pressurize him in any way. Whereas his father was a much more tranquil person who had an inner peace and was really happy with the moment and just said to George, "Oh, why don't you go to Manchester University? It's much nearer."
Which is, and that's quite sort of progressive parenting, isn't it, for this particular time? Because I suppose the thing would be to get a nice middle class job and settle down. I mean, not go to a university per se, and certainly not one of the big ones like Oxford or Manchester.
No, and perhaps not to Balliol. He chose the college that was probably the hardest to get into at Oxford. He won a scholarship because he couldn't really have afforded to go there. And he didn't work terribly hard in his first year. He had a bit of a telling off from the master of the college, who said he expected him to get a first, which he did, in fact. And he then progressed to qualify as a barrister, and he got a distinction in his bar exam. So he was really on a roll from then on. But it wasn't at all easy. I mean, his best friend was Robin Day, who went into radio and television and always had a lot more money than George, and used to take George out for the odd dinner because poor George couldn't afford to go out at all. And they really talked about swapping careers, because I think Robin Day would have loved to be a barrister and George would have loved to have some sort of income, but it never happened. And it was a difficult career at the very start. He used to say, when George was in the north starting off, he'd say, "You go and do unimportant cases in courts you couldn't find for fees you didn't get."
That's fascinating that Sir Robin Day was a friend, because his biography is Grand Inquisitor. That's the name of the biography. The autobiography,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah.
Yes. And in fact, in one or two cases, George would practice his cross-examination with Robin Day.
Good. I'm just imagining it being a fly on the wall on a dinner table between those two. That would have been highly entertaining.
Very much so.
So he's practicing he's practicing law in these far-flung courtrooms throughout the UK. What is it that brings him to prominence? I mean, every sense to think sort of was it 73, 74 and the Thorpe trial?
It was 78 to 79,
right.
Really.
Yeah.
Prior to that, he did a case, quite a famous case called the Big Dipper. He was acting for a manager. There was a fun fair, and one of the cars came off the rails and 5 children were killed. And George was acting for the manager. Sir David Napley happened to be in court co-defending. And as you probably remember, Sir David Napley was president of the Law Society, very formidable character, very well-known solicitor. And after seeing George cross-examine in that case, he went up to him and said, next time I get a big criminal case, I shall be using you to cross-examine. And then his very next case, a few months later, was Jeremy Thorpe. And funnily enough, George had actually been at Oxford with Jeremy Thorpe. I even have a copy of a debate paper that was given to me by John Matthew, who co-defended with George. He sadly died a couple of years ago, but he was a wonderful barrister. He was our senior Treasury counsel at the Old Bailey and did all the very big cases. And in that debate paper, you can see that Jeremy was the president and George was one of the debaters. So they formed a friendship many, many years ago, and that was the case of Jeremy Thorpe.
What was it that made George such a good cross-examiner? Was it his style? Was he flamboyant? Was he incisive? Did he listen? Because we're always told, I mean, most of us, thankfully, if we're not in the profession, that we don't tend to get involved in courtrooms. So we tend to think of it as all being, thankfully via Hollywood or by our TV screens and, these big barnstorming performances. But what was George's style that marked him out?
Well, I think he had great timing. He would cross-examine a witness and then he'd pause like a great Shakespearean actor and stare at the witnesses. And as Lord Alexander said in the eulogy, which he gave after George's death, that he had this great ability to look straight into the eyes of jurors because of the slightly raised area in which they'd be seated and because of his short height, which he always denied. He always said he was taller than he was. His eyes would meet with the jurors and he'd follow them the whole way through the case. He'd keep his eye on the judge and his opponent, but basically he'd try and immerse himself in the jurors and how they were feeling, really, and thinking. And he really was able to do that. He had a great interest in the human condition. I think that dates back to when he was at a Roman Catholic seminary and he was going to be trained to become a priest, actually, initially. So I think that's really his great strength, and that he was a real terrier. I mean, he was interested in getting to the bottom of a case, and he really wouldn't let a witness go until he got the answer he wanted. And sometimes he'd say, well, I'm going to ask this question and I will ask it a second time. And if I don't get the answer I want, I'll move on to the next. So he put a witness under pressure. And I know people like Janny Allen and I think Gillian Tailforth found it very difficult. I think it was worse for the female witnesses in a way, because he was really quite to the point with them. And I think they felt out of their comfort level. And he was also so clever with his ability to bring a rabbit out of a hat, so that if he was doing a case, something would suddenly be produced at the 11th hour. I mean, in Janny Allen's case, suddenly diaries were produced from under the floorboards in her apartment by a colleague of hers who'd been renting a room in her apartment. And it sort of basically completely tore to bits her evidence, saying that she was sort of naive sexually. And it gave the impression that she had written a lot about explicit sex. And it was, a lot of it was fiction, but in her own life. And the same in the Gillian Telforth case, really.
Mm. Do you think that perhaps because he came from, because of his background from, so we say, humble beginnings, and he hadn't done the usual sort of prep school, public school, university, he got to university on a scholarship, that therefore, because when you are in court, when you are cross-examining, when you are presenting a case, it is about observing people, isn't it? And observing the mood of the room. And it's a word that George would probably hate, empathy, but empathizing or knowing from whence the person you're cross-examining or the person you're defending is coming from. And George perhaps had that more so than perhaps those of his contemporaries who hadn't come from such a humble background.
Yes, I think very much so. And also the fact that when he started his career in the north of England, he did a lot of personal injury cases. So he was dealing with people who had legal aid rather than being privately funded for cases. Some of them were very poor. And the whole spectrum of human tragedy, with people losing limbs or having terrible factory accidents. And he found that really quite humbling. And I'm sure that was a very good sounding board for his latter career, really.
The Thorpe case, I mean, just refresh our memories, because unfortunately, it's a long time ago now, but it was, if you like, up to that point, a huge scandal, and especially in the 70s, and when it took place, it was a Sunday Times expose. It wasn't. I seem to remember reading it in the Sunday Times colour supplement that my parents had left lying around and being scandalised.
I think the main scandal was that obviously that was in the days when homosexuality between two men was illegal. And of course, not only was he, the implication was that he'd had a relationship with one man, certainly, and several other came to note. And of course, in those days, particularly being a prominent politician as well, it was quite disastrous for his career, and also being illegal made it very difficult for him.
When did you first come into to George Carman's orbit, and what was it like? Because obviously, when you met him, early 80s, mid 80s, he was pretty much a household name. He was perhaps the most famous in the UK. I mean, that must have, presumably, you must have taken a deep breath before knocking on the door or walking into his chambers.
Well, I tell you what was very funny. I was introduced to him by a Greek Cypriot member of my chambers, who was a great friend of George's, and thought that it would be a very good idea for the two of us to meet. I think he had some sort of romantic idea that George and I would sort of get married and go off into the future together. And I, of course, hated the idea that he might be trying to introduce me for this reason. And I used to go to Daly's Wine Bar, you probably remember that, along from the Cheshire Cheese in Essex Street. And I would often see George there at the end of the day with people gathered all around him. And he was sort of telling stories of what had gone on that day in court. And I thought, gosh, he's so popular. How lovely to be like that. But I thought it would be lovely to meet him as a person, but I had no particular desire to have a romantic arrangement.
And so, I mean, you got to know the man himself. And again, behind all that sort of steely resolve and immaculately tailored suits, because he always looked the part, didn't he? Absolutely.
He did.
He became a favourite of celebrities, but not a celebrity lawyer, if that makes sense.
Yes. I think he was a favourite of celebrities because they loved the fact that he completely immersed himself into their case. And celebrities very often have big egos, and they need to have someone who's totally absorbed by them. And it's quite difficult, I think, with lawyers to find that. I mean, you might have a lawyer who's brilliant at advocacy or a brilliant legal mind, but it would be quite difficult to find someone with both. And of course, everybody thinks of George as being a great advocate and perhaps not being such a great lawyer. But as I've said before, with his first at Oxford and his distinction in the bar exams, he was actually very capable of being a great lawyer, but he just actually much preferred the advocacy. And James Price, who was his junior in many cases, always laughs about the fact that when there was a matter of law, he'd very often turn to his junior and say, now perhaps you can address the jury on this matter, because he couldn't really be bothered to do it.
Delegation is always an important part of any case. When it comes to writing, because he passed in 2001, which again,
Yes.
the time, it seems only it's 20 years ago.
Yes.
Putting this together, how did you put it together? And he's a friend, he's a colleague, he's a close friend. It must have been a great thing to do, but at the same time, on a personal level, it must have pulled on the heartstrings a bit as well.
It was a really hard project, actually. I'm not a writer. I'd never done very much writing. And I found the whole idea of going back through all the medical side of his sad illness of cancer, the last 5 years of his life, where I actually spent a lot of time helping him because he was very worried that the press would know that he had cancer. And therefore, the moment that was known, his reputation would be in question. And even during the case of Muhammad Al-Fayed and Neil Hamilton, he was having radiotherapy every morning before going to court. And for a lot of people, it's very draining. So he had the great capacity to carry on regardless. But really, he only retired because his prostate cancer was becoming bad. It had deteriorated to such an extent that it had travelled into the bones, and it meant that he'd have to walk occasionally with a stick. And he even discussed with me how we could sort of get him into court without anybody seeing him walking with a stick, and that how he could sort of perhaps even get permission to sit in court. But he just didn't want to carry on in that way. So he passed a lot of his work on before he actually retired.
What do you hope? Sorry,
I was going to say it was with great agony that he actually retired, because he would never have retired if it hadn't been his health.
What are you hoping that people will take from the book? Is it a fully rounded picture of the man himself?
Yes, it's more about his cases, and he wrote with me 3 chapters, which I've included in the book, because although he always planned to write a book, I don't think he'd ever have got around to it, because he was always the sort of person who needed a bomb under him to do some work, unless it was something that meant going to court the next day. And I think that it would have been a very difficult project for him.
What do you think? What do you think was his finest hour then? When you think of George Carman QC, because they're now Casey's, of course, but what springs to mind? What moment encapsulates the man?
I think probably the Thorpe case was his great achievement, in that what was clever, he'd spend weeks and weeks thinking of sound bites or something to say to the jury. And as you know, in that case, I mean, Jeremy Thorpe, having been leader of the Liberal Party, having been an MP for many years, he decided on capitalising on that. And he said to the jury at the very end, Thorpe in his time had won millions of votes from people in this country, and now come the 12 most precious votes of all. And he looked into the eyes of every juror, and he pointed individually to each one and said, yours and yours and yours. And, I think they were all spellbound by that. And then the other case that I would say really had a big impact on him was the case of Dr. Leonard Arthur, who was the leading pediatrician who was charged with murder of a Down syndrome baby because he ordered nil by mouth. And this baby just died naturally. But there was a member of Life who was working in the hospital at that time, and he reported him. And it was just incredible to hear all those consultants in court giving evidence saying, well, if he's guilty of murder, we all are, because we would all act in this way in this case. And thankfully, the charge was reduced to manslaughter and he was acquitted. But I think that case had a tremendous impact on his life. In fact, sadly, Dr. Arthur died within a few months of that case. I think the pressure was just so stressful. And there was a lovely letter from his daughter basically saying that, you know, it had a great impact on his life, obviously.
The book is called Get Carmen. Wonderful title, by the way. It made me smile very much when I saw the title for it. The book is called Get Carmen. It is by Karen Phillips. You can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Karen, I know that you're new to social media, but where is the best place to try and, in the nicest possible way, find you?
Well, if you look up K Phillips, I don't even know what it's under, but I think it's that on Instagram and possibly Facebook or LinkedIn. But I will definitely try and get a bit better at being a bit more modern.
Right. Well, we shall let our listeners know that when you take those first steps, fear not. The book is called Get Carmen, in court with George Carman QC, Britain's most feared lawyer, the man behind the advocate. It is by Karen Phillips. Karen, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Giles. Very enjoyable.